She turned her face slightly toward me, not with surprise, not even with anger, just with that strange, careful smile people wear when they're trying not to make a scene. "You shouldn't be here," she said. Her lips barely moved, and yet I heard every syllable like a church bell inside my chest. There was music playing, white chairs lined the lawn. Cake stood under a silk canopy, trimmed in flowers that matched her bouquetful hydrangeas and cream roses. Everyone clapped as the couple laughed and posed for photos beneath the arbor. Everyone applauded except for me. I was still standing at the edge of the garden, holding the gift bag I'd chosen with care. Still trying to make sense of what she'd said. "You shouldn't be here. I'm Mary Carson. I'm 72. And that was the moment I knew my daughter had already erased me from her life. She just hadn't gotten around to telling me. Subscribe and tell me in the comments where you're watching from. Thanks, I hadn't even planned on coming. Invitation hadn't arrived until a week before the wedding, and even then it came addressed to Ms. M. Carson. With no return address, no mention of Mom. There was no mention of a +1. There was only a specific time, place, and dress code to follow. Still, I bought a pale blue dress from the outlet mall in Larkspur and had it altered to fit me properly. Spent more than I should have on a silver necklace with a locket, the kind that opens with a hinge. Inside, I placed a photo of her as a baby wrinkled from my wallet, but still clear. She'd had a bit of colic then, but she always smiled when I sang to her. I thought she might want to wear it on her wedding day. I didn't realize I'd never get close enough to hand it to her. I stood there for a while longer after she walked away, the bag still in my hands. No one greeted me. A few people looked my way and then looked away quickly, the way you do when you see something out of place, a misplaced coat, a dog where dogs shouldn't be. I left the gift beneath the table by the cards box. I didn't wait for the ceremony to end. I walked back to my car, sat inside with the door closed, watching the breeze play through the trees, and realized I couldn't cry. I was too worn out. People think these moments happen like explosions, but no, occasionally the worst part is how quiet it all is. That night, back home in my little rental near the sea cliffs, I boiled water for tea and sat by the window, listening to the kettle sigh. My neighbor's dog barked twice. A moth bumped gently against the glass. Life moved on, the way it always does. I thought about the time I taught her how to ride a bike. How she'd refused the training wheels and scraped her knees until they bled. How she got back up again and again. I remembered her ballet recitals, where she danced in shoes too tight and ribbons I had ironed the night before. Even when my hands were trembling from arthritis. But memory doesn't always comfort. Occasionally, it just adds weight to the ache. She hadn't introduced me to her fiancé until after they'd already signed the lease together. I was never asked to help with the dress, the flowers, the guest list. She'd said she was too busy, that I wouldn't understand modern weddings. I did understand. However, my understanding differed from her perception. The truth was simple. She didn't want me there. But she'd sent the invitation anyway. Perhaps she did so out of guilt. Maybe out of obligation. Perhaps she felt compelled to do so because someone told her she should. I kept playing her words back in my mind. You shouldn't be here. It wasn't just the words. It was the calm in her voice, like she'd rehearsed it, like she'd known I might come, and planned for how to remove me gently without fuss. She had become someone I didn't recognize, but more painfully, someone who didn't recognize me. That night, after the tea had gone cold, I opened the closet and pulled down the wedding albums. Hers, mine, my mother's. I looked through them one by one, in mine. I stood in a modest lace gown, smiling with a kind of hope that now seems foreign. My mother's face was beside mine, strong and soft, holding my bouquet with proud. Wrinkled fingers dotted my daughter's wedding. I had no place. Not in the photos, not in the memories. The light never quite lands at the edge of the garden where the shadows reach. So I sat with the silence. I let it settle. Let it become something real, and then, slowly, I began to ask myself the question I had avoided for years. What happens when you've given your life to someone who no longer sees you? That night didn't answer it, but it started the unraveling. The necklace sat unopened in the gift bag, resting in the dark beneath a table I would never see again. And for the first time in a long while, I didn't feel like chasing anything anymore. Not explanations, not apologies. She didn't even make an effort to apologize. She wasn't born into wealth, my daughter. She was born into oatmeal mornings and secondhand shoes polished to look new. She was brought into the world of late-night fevers and borrowed textbooks, into love stitched into every seam of a life I tried to hold together with hands that never quite stopped trembling. I wasn't a perfect mother, but I was there. In the early years, I worked evenings at a diner just off the A6, taking tips and coins and walking home under orange streetlights. By day, I worked the desk at the dental clinic, not glamorous, but it came with health benefits. And in between, I folded laundry with one hand and held her with the other. She had asthma when she was little. Nights were often interrupted by wheezing fits, and I'd sit beside her bed counting her breaths, praying each one would come easier than the last. I remember the sound of the humidifier humming through winter, and how I'd carry her into the bathroom and run a hot shower just to help her breathe. She never knew that. I skipped meals sometimes so she wouldn't have to. Or that the dress she wore to the 6th grade dance had been sewn from the lining of an old curtain I found at a charity shop. She only knew it made her feel like Cinderella, and that was enough for me. I remember staying up nights during her exams, whispering affirmations into the hallway outside her bedroom so she'd never feel alone. I kept every note she ever wrote me, even the crumpled ones from when she was angry. "You don't get it, Mom," she once scribbled. "You always make it about you." I cried reading that one, not because she was wrong, but because I didn't know how to explain that everything had been about her, that she was the center of my whole life. I remember her wedding now, not for the flowers or the dress, but for what it erased, everything that had come before. The year she went off to university, I sold my engagement ring to help with tuition. I never told her. I just said the money had come from a savings account. She thought I was being generous. I was just being a mother. There were other things, quieter things. I patiently waited outside her ballet lessons, even during the snowfall. Every holiday, we let her choose the last piece of pie. When finances were tight, I made sure to turn off the heater to keep her. Room warm. She wanted a dog when she was 9. And I knew we couldn't afford one, but I found a rescue that waived the adoption fee. And we brought home Daisy, a bony little terrier mix who slept at her feet for 7 years. When Daisy died, I buried her myself in the woods behind our flat, and my daughter never knew the tears I cried that night weren't just for the dog. They were for the life I was losing piece by piece. Year by year, as she grew into someone whose footsteps echoed away from me, she started calling less after university. And when she did, the calls were clipped, distracted, like I was something she had to check off. But I kept sending birthday cards. I remembered her friends' names. I mailed care packages to every address she gave, even the ones she moved from, without telling me first. When she got her first real job, I sent her a pressed white blouse wrapped in tissue paper. She never called to say if it fit. When she broke up with her fiancé the first time I was there, holding her hand on the kitchen floor, making soup she didn't eat. When they got back together, I smiled and said I was happy for her. Even though I wasn't sure I was . It wasn't about judgment. It was about trying to stay close to someone who kept drifting. I used to imagine that one day she'd see the full picture, that love wasn't always loud. Sometimes it looked like folded towels, packed lunches, and handwritten notes tucked under pillows. But I don't think she ever did . At her bridal shower, I wasn't invited to speak. I wasn't even seated near her. I was seated at a table with a few elderly relatives out of the way. I watched as her friends toasted her with stories I wasn't part of. I laughed at jokes that I didn't understand. Still, I stayed. I smiled, I wrote a check and left it in her card box with a ribbon. It was cashed 2 days later. There's something about being a mother, especially an older one, that feels like slowly becoming wallpaper. You're there, you hold the structure. However, you remain unseen. And yet, I kept showing up. That's what love has always meant to me. I didn't make grand gestures. I valued quiet persistence over grand gestures. I didn't want medals. I didn't want praise. I just wanted to be part of her life. The cruelest realization is that, for a long time, I believed I was part of her life. Until that wedding day, when all the threads I'd been quietly stitching for decades were snipped. With one sentence, "You shouldn't be here," and suddenly, I realized maybe I never truly was. It never happens all at once. That's the thing people don't understand. A mother's heartbreak doesn't come like thunder. It comes like fog. Soft, slow, almost invisible. Until one morning, you wake up and realize you're lost in it. I used to think love was strongest in the big moments: childbirth, graduation, emergencies in the middle of the night. But no, the test of love is in the quiet things. It also erodes over time. Many small moments occurred that should have served as warnings to me. The first time she forgot my birthday, she sent a text the next day. "Sorry, work was insane. Love you." No call, no card. Just that. And I told myself it was fine because she was busy. The next year, she didn't forget. But she didn't call either. It's just a message that said, "Enjoy your day." Like I was some Facebook acquaintance. I baked myself a little lemon cake that year, sat in the kitchen with one candle lit, and sang quietly under my breath. It sounds pitiful now, I know, but at the time I told myself it was sweet, dignified. She stopped coming home for the holidays. First, it was the job, then it was the weather, then it was her partner's family. I understood. Life pulls people in different directions, but even understanding has a shelf life. 1 year, mailed her a Christmas parcel socks. I knitted a jar of my plum preserves and a scarf in her favorite shade of green. It was returned to sender unopened. There was no forwarding address provided. When I called to ask, she said, "Oh yeah, we moved a few months ago." Didn't I mention it? No, she hadn't. The green scarf sat in my hall closet for years. I didn't have the heart to give it away. There were times I'd drive past her part of town just to feel close. If I never stopped in, that would have felt invasive. But sometimes I'd park across from the cafe she used to like and sit there for 10-15 minutes, watching the people come and go. I was always hopeful that I might chance upon a glimpse of her. It was a comforting reminder that she was still alive when she got promoted at work. I found out through a colleague of mine whose daughter worked at the same firm, not from her. She didn't even send a message announcing her promotion, and when she sent out engagement announcements, mine arrived last. I know because the date stamp on the envelope was 3 days later than her friend's posts online. I kept that envelope. It's in the drawer with the others. The envelope's addressed to M. Carson are written in careful, cold handwriting. Not Mom, not even Mother. They referred to me only by initials, as if I were merely a formality. There were other things too, smaller, but they add up. She didn't ask me to help shop for the dress. She didn't seek my advice on the vows or venue selection. I watched her curate an entire bridal world without me, all while telling others my mother and I are close. That phrase, "we're close," began to feel like a lie that she told to appear kind. It wasn't a genuine statement, and I said nothing. I didn't want to be the needy one. I didn't want to be the resentful mother who was unable to let go. I told myself I was giving her space, being respectful, and letting her become the woman she needed to be. But space turned into silence, and silence turned into absence. I started to notice how I was the last to know things. The last to be told, the first to be forgotten. At her engagement dinner, I was seated far from the main table, next to her partner's distant cousin who didn't even know her birthday. And when they clinked glasses and toasted the people who made us who we are, her eyes scanned the room but never landed on me. That evening, I strolled home in uncomfortable heels, toting the leftovers they had thoughtfully wrapped for me. Occasionally, I wonder if she noticed how I shrank year after year, how my voice softened, my opinions went quiet, how I stopped asking questions. Maybe she thought I was content. Maybe she didn't think about it at all. There was one moment I remember with particular clarity. We were sitting in a cafe years. I'll go now, and I was telling her about a neighbor who had passed away. I remember saying something like, "It's strange how time just folds people away." She looked up from her phone and said, "You're being dramatic again, Mom." I stopped talking after that. We finished our coffee in silence. She paid the bill and left without hugging me goodbye. I walked home slower than usual that day, step heavy with words I'd swallowed. I learned over time that love, real love, can't survive one way. It needs acknowledgement, a glance, a call. A plate was saved at the table. It doesn't need grand gestures, but it needs something. And with her, I began to realize that what I was offering, years of it, all of it, had become invisible. She didn't hate me. That would have been easier, in a way. No. She had simply edited me out. She treated me as if I were a blurred background object in a photograph. Technically, I was still there. However, it no longer serves as the primary focus. I wish I could say I grew angry then. But I in single quotes. It was worse than anger. It was quiet. There is a kind of betrayal that doesn't shout. It arrives with paperwork, arrives with signatures and certified envelopes and quiet instructions given behind closed doors. It doesn't raise its voice because it doesn't need to, simply rewrites the truth while you're not looking. That final line was crossed on a Tuesday. I had gone to the bank that morning to inquire about consolidating a small account. Something. It started after my husband passed. Nothing large. Just a bit I'd tucked away over the years from odd jobs, a small pension, the occasional birthday money I never spent. I wanted to simplify things. I was getting older. I wanted to make sure everything was in order. The clerk, a young man with careful eyes, tapped away at the keyboard and then paused. He turned the screen slightly and said, "It looks like your daughter is listed as a co-owner on this account." I blinked. "No," I said, calm but confused. "That's not right. It's just me." He was kind, too kind, the kind of kind. "That tells you the damage is already done." "Actually," he said gently, "the name was added just over 9 months ago." "Would you like me to print the authorization form?" I nodded, slowly. I still remember the way the paper felt in my hand. There. It was my signature or something close enough to it. The loops weren't quite right. The spacing between my middle initial and surname was off. But unless you'd watched me sign my name 100 times, you might not notice. She had signed for me and someone had let her. I didn't say anything in that moment. I said nothing to the clerk. I said nothing to the manager either. I thanked them, left the bank, and walked home in a silence so thick I couldn't hear the birds in the hedges or the gravel underfoot. I didn't cry. I didn't scream, but I knew this wasn't forgetfulness. It wasn't thoughtlessness. This was intentional. It had always been in the back of my mind, the way she asked about my affairs after her father passed. The way she'd once said, "It's just easier if I help manage things. You know, to save you the trouble." And I had nodded. I had said thank you. I had believed even then that she meant well. But now I realized that while I was trying to preserve what little I had left, the life I'd built through sacrifice, the dignity I held on to like a lifeline, she had been quietly rearranging the furniture of my future. Later that week, I checked the title on the flat I rented out in town, the small one my husband had left me. The one that brought in enough to cover groceries and utilities. Her name was there too. Again, added without my consent. I don't know how many people understand what that does to a person. Knowing that your own child has forged your name is a devastating experience. This was done not to shield you from harm, wasn't intended to aid you. Instead, it's a discreet attempt to seize what you haven't yet provided. It wasn't about the money. It wasn't even about the legality. It was about the shift. She had stopped seeing me as her mother and started seeing me as a resource. She now views me as a valuable asset. She now viewed me as an asset to manage. I didn't confront her. I see OULD in single quotes. There are certain betrayals that steal even the energy for confrontation. They make you fold inward, like paper in the rain. Instead, I sat in the corner of the garden for hours that evening, staring out at the ivy growing along the fence. I thought about my mother. Despite the limited resources we had, she still managed to provide so much. I thought about the birthday when my daughter gave me a painted frame that said, "Best Mom Ever," a frame that now sat dusty in a drawer, its sentiment a relic from another life. And I thought about the way she looked at me at the wedding. She seemed to perceive me as a hindrance. That was the week. I called a solicitor. I didn't tell anyone. Even my neighbor, who usually knows everything before I do, was kept in the dark. I made an appointment, gathered my documents, and sat in the stuffy little office with my hands in my lap like a schoolgirl. The solicitor, a woman about my daughter's age, listened. She didn't interrupt. She just nodded and asked the right questions. When I showed her the forged documents, her mouth tightened. "This happens more than people think," she said, "but most never catch it." She helped me undo what I could. We drafted new documents. We filed a notice. We locked what needed locking. End. Then we revised the will. She asked me gently, "Would you like your daughter listed as a beneficiary?" I paused. I could still hear my daughter's voice in my head. "You shouldn't be here." "No," I said, "not anymore." I didn't say it with anger. I said it like someone turning out a light. After the visit to the solicitor, I didn't tell anyone what I'd done. Not her, not her brother, not the neighbor who still waved through the hedge most mornings. I just stopped, not in a bitter way, not even in a way that would be noticed immediately. I simply removed my weight from the spaces I had once occupied. There's a kind of power in silence, but it doesn't feel like power at first. It feels like grief. It's akin to stepping out into the cold and letting the door close behind you. I stopped sending birthday cards. I stopped calling on Sundays. I stopped pretending that I was being remembered when, in truth, I was just remembering them. I used to bake around the holidays cinnamon rolls, scones, little shortbreads pressed with a fork. I'd freeze them, wrap them in foil, and post them in little tins, hoping they'd smile when they opened the box. I stopped doing that too. I didn't delete her number, didn't block her calls, didn't make a scene. I just withdrew. At first, it felt unnatural. It felt as though I was violating a fundamental principle of motherhood. But over time, it started to feel like a kind of exhale. For the first time in years, I sat in my kitchen and drank my tea while it was still hot. I lit a candle, not for her, not for memory, but for the soft hush of the morning. For myself, I opened the windows again, cleaned out the drawers of old cards and trinkets and empty gestures. I sorted through what I'd been carrying. Some I burned. Some I boxed. Some I simply let go. There's a strange loneliness in motherhood that no one talks about. We think it's just the empty nest, but it's more than that. It's the ache of being known so deeply once, your touch, your voice, your smell, and then being slowly forgotten by the very person who once cried if you walked away. I had felt that ache for years, but now I stopped feeding it. Instead, I read, I walked. I spoke to the birds on the fence. I started making small changes. I canceled an automatic deposit that had been going into her joint account. I opened a new one in my name alone at a different bank. I spoke with a woman at the community legal office about power of attorney, revised the documents, removed names, added boundaries. Not because I was angry, but because I realized no one was looking out for me but me. One night, opened the locket I had meant to give her at the wedding, opened the locket containing her baby photo. I looked at it for a long time, then gently closed it again. I placed it on my nightstand and left it there, not as a symbol, but simply as a reminder of something I once carried close. She didn't notice my silence at first. Weeks passed. then months. Eventually, a text came. "Hey, haven't heard from you? Everything okay?" I didn't respond. Not because I was punishing her, but because I had nothing left to explain. When you dedicate your entire life to someone who fails to meet your expectations, there comes a moment when your resolve falters. I had reached that point. Silence isn't loud. It doesn't slam doors or raise voices. It just stays quiet like frost. It feels as though the tide has already receded. I thought of her childhood often in those early weeks of silence. How she used to crawl into my bed when thunderstorms rattled the windows. How she'd whisper, "Don't leave," even in her sleep. But now it was I who had left, not physically, not with bitterness, but emotionally, entirely. And I realized she didn't chase that. More than anything, told me I'd made the right choice. Something quiet shifted after that winter. It wasn't dramatic. It wasn't sudden. It was more like this slow return of color to a faded photograph, the subtle realization that the world could still feel warm, even if certain hands no longer reached for mine. I didn't wake up one morning with a plan. It wasn't revenge. It wasn't even courage. It was just movement, slow, sure, and mine. For years, I'd lived in a house filled with echoes, still made tea for two, still arranged cutlery as though someone might drop by. Even the sofa had a way of remembering company, by leaning slightly toward the space where no one sat anymore. But something changed after the silence. I began rearranging the furniture. Quite literally at first, pushed the sofa to the opposite wall. Donated the china cabinet I hadn't opened in a decade. I boxed up the wedding albums and the christening gown and placed them in the attic. Not with anger, but with the soft finality of someone closing a book she no longer needs to reread. Then I started walking more. There's a park near the cliffs, not far, but I used to avoid it. The park was crowded with strollers. The park served as a constant reminder. But now I walked there daily, my scarf tied tight and my feet steady. It was on one of those walks that I met Margaret. She was in her late 60s, wore bright red shoes, and always brought a thermos of coffee she claimed was better than any cafes. She was sharp-tongued, a candide, the sort of woman who had lived through loss and learned how to laugh anyway. We started walking together, then sitting on the bench that overlooked the tide, talking, not about children or regrets, but about books and birds and how good it felt to sit still without needing to explain anything to anyone. One morning, she brought an extra cup of coffee and said, "You're different lately." I smiled. "I think I am." I didn't tell her everything, but I told her enough. She nodded slowly, then said something I'll never forget. "You don't owe your peace to the people who stole it." That sentence settled in me like a stone in still water. From there, I made other changes. I closed the joint accounts, rewrote the power of attorney, ensured that everything, the flat, the savings, the modest investments, was in my name alone. Then I sat with the solicitor again and finalized the new will. This time, the beneficiaries were chosen with care. This was not due to adherence to tradition, not out of guilt. Instead, my actions stemmed from a quiet truth. I donated a portion to a women's shelter, another visit to the hospice, which took such gentle care of my sister. I listed a few dear friends, Margaret, even the woman who runs the secondhand bookshop, who always sets aside novels, she thinks. I'll like my daughter's name wasn't there. This was not intended as a form of punishment. But because I'd come to understand something no one ever says out loud, you don't pass down your life's work to someone who couldn't be bothered to witness it. I started spending the money, one saved for emergencies. I bought a second-hand upright piano, hired a young teacher half my age who came on Thursdays with sheet music and patient fingers. I hadn't played in decades, but the keys still remembered me. I traveled too, took the train to Edinburgh. I strolled through the cobblestone streets under the pouring rain, ate soup alone in a quiet cafe, and felt more seen than I had in years. I started journaling at night, not about her, not anymore, but about small things, the way the wind moved the curtains, the feel of fresh sheets, the warmth of a wool sock drying on the radiator, There's a strange freedom that comes when you finally stop chasing the version of love you always hoped they'd give you. You learn to love differently, more inward, more gently. I used to think that healing would come with some grand moment, an apology maybe, or a letter. But healing came on a Tuesday, sitting by the window, watching steam rise from my tea, and realizing I hadn't thought about her in days, not in bitterness, not even in longing, just hadn't thought of her. That's when I knew, had moved differently, not just through my house or through my finances, but through my heart. And for the first time in a long time, I didn't feel like something missing. I felt whole. It took longer than I expected. The silence, at first I thought there might be a reaction, a phone call, a knock at the door, even a letter laced with cold civility. But there was nothing. And then, slowly, there was everything. I suppose that's how it works when people expect you to orbit them. When you step out of the pattern, they don't notice at first. The gravity shift is subtle, but eventually things begin to drift. The first ripple came from her brother. He called one evening, voice cautious. "Ma'am," he said, "did you change something in the will?" I hadn't told him, not out of secrecy, but because it wasn't about revenge. It was about release. I said yes, gently. He was quiet, not angry, just aware. "I figured," he said. "She's been asking around," sounding rattled. I asked him if she was all right. "Old habits die hard." He hesitated, then said she's not used to not having control. That was the first time it struck me. Maybe I had given her too much of it. It's too much space to assume, to decide, to edit me out until she no longer remembered what I had carried. And now, without my silence propping her up, things were shifting. I never meant to hurt her, but I think I needed her to feel the absence of something she had once believed would always be there. I heard she reached out to the solicitor, not to apologize, just to inquire, as if I were a property she had once assumed would be hers. But it wasn't just the money. That's the mistake people make when they talk about wills and inheritance. What I had given all my life was presence. And when I took that back, the absence made noise. Holidays passed. I spent them with Margaret and her cousin in Devon, wrapped in blankets and laughter, with mugs of cider and pies that tasted like old joy. My daughter, I heard, hosted smaller gatherings that felt less anchored. That was the word someone used, anchored, because that's what I had been, I suppose. Not a centerpiece, but the quiet center. The thing you don't appreciate until it's gone, like a pilot light or the weight of a steady coat on your shoulders. One afternoon, I received a message from an old friend of hers, someone who used to call me Auntie Mary when they were 12. She wrote, "Hi, I don't mean to overstep, but I wanted to say I always thought the way you supported her growing up was incredible. She talks less about you these days, but some of us remember. It's made me cry. Not because I needed validation, but because memory, when shared by someone else, becomes proof that you were real, that your love had shape, that you mattered." I didn't write back. I just placed the message in a folder I now keep for quiet affirmations, little signs that, though she had removed me from her narrative, I hadn't been invisible to everyone, and in the space where her absence once ached, something else began to grow. People came into my life who didn't need me to be anything other than who I was. The woman at the market who always sets aside the freshest bread. The boy down the street who asks me about birds. Margaret, who started calling me her sister by the sea. Without meaning to, I had formed a small circle of souls who noticed when I wasn't there. Meanwhile, my daughter, I imagine, began to notice when I wasn't there too. No more gifts wrapped in silver foil. No more gentle reminders. No more notes tucked into cards with little hearts drawn beside my name. And it mattered. Eventually, it mattered. Not because I was cruel, but because even the most independent among us still want to be held by the roots that made us. One morning, months after that final silence, I received a package. No note, just the locket, the one I'd meant to give her at the wedding. She'd found it. Somehow, perhaps the groom returned it, or she'd seen it among the things left by the card table. I held it in my hand for a long while, and then I placed it in a drawer. Not because I rejected it, but because I no longer needed it to hold me together. She had lost something, though I don't know if she fully understood what. It wasn't the will, wasn't the inheritance it. Was access not to the woman who had stitched her life together? With aching fingers and quiet pride, to the mother who had once stood at the edge of her wedding, not as a guest, but as a ghost. It took me weeks to begin the letter, and months to finish it. I didn't even know who I was writing it for at first, not her. I had nothing left to say to my daughter that I hadn't already said in silence. It began as something small, a note scribbled on the back of a grocery list. You were never invisible. I just didn't know how to be seen by someone who stopped looking. From there, it grew. A few lines in the margin of my journal. Sentences drafted and crossed out, some too soft, others too angry. And then one late spring morning, sat down at the kitchen table, the sun slanting through the window, cup of strong tea beside me, and I wrote the whole thing. Not to her, but to the woman I used to be, the one who stood, alone at the back of her daughter's wedding, clutching a gift bag and trying to convince herself that she still had a place. I wrote, you didn't deserve that. You didn't imagine it. You weren't too sensitive, too needy, too much. You were present, and they treated you like absence. I told her that love doesn't mean losing yourself entirely. That motherhood is sacred, yes, but it should not be martyrdom. That being forgotten by someone you raised is not a reflection of your failure. It's a reflection of how they learned to look past what was always right in front of them. I wrote about the small betrayals she endured. It's the way she baked and knitted and sent cards that were never answered. I wrote about how proud I was of her for finally stopping, for not calling back, for taking her name off accounts and her heart out of the waiting room. I reminded her that boundaries are not punishments. They are doors you close when the draft has grown cold and cruel. And then I thanked her for surviving it all. I folded the letter once, placed it in an envelope, wrote no name on the front. I walked to the cliffs, where the sea pulls at the earth-like memory. I stood there a while watching the gulls, listening to the wind, feeling the edges of the paper in my fingers. Then I tore it in half, not out of anger, but because I know it's longer needed to hold it. It had already changed me. Letting go isn't always dramatic. Sometimes it's just standing at the edge of a cliff with no witnesses and giving something back to the wind. I left the pieces there, waited under a stone. Let the salt air do the rest. That night, I slept without waking. No dreams, no clenched jaw. Just quiet. I didn't write again for a while. I didn't need to, because I finally understood something that had eluded me for years. Forgiveness doesn't always mean letting them back in. Sometimes it just means letting yourself go free. Let me know when you're ready for Part 9. The final chapter. The house is still, not silent in the way grief is, but quiet in the way peace is. The kind that doesn't need to announce itself. It's the kind you notice only when you realize you haven't felt anxious in days. I wake early now. Not because I have to, just because the light through the kitchen window is too beautiful to miss. There's a routine, not rigid, but gentle. I water the violets on the windowsill. I open the back door and let the morning air touch my face. I steep my tea and journal a little, sometimes a sentence, sometimes nothing at all. And no one interrupts. I've grown fond of small things. The way sunlight collects in corners, the smell of old paperbacks, the sound of a neighbor's child, laughing down the lane. Sometimes I sit in the garden and let my hands fall still in my lap, just breathing. Margaret comes by on Tuesdays. We play cards or walk to the bakery. Last week we sat on the bench by the sea and talked about what it means to grow older without bitterness. There's no rule, she said. You can end your life softer than it began. I liked that. I've stopped explaining myself to people, not out of spite, but because I've finally understood that not every story needs an audience. Some things are just for living, not retelling. My daughter hasn't called in months. There's no anger in me anymore when I say that. Just a stillness. Like watching a train pass that you were never meant to board. I imagine she still tells people, we're complicated. I imagine she edits the story in her favor, because people do that when they're not ready to face what they've done, and that's all right. I no longer need her to say sorry. I no longer need to be remembered by someone who forgot me while I was still alive. Instead, I remember myself. I remember the girl who walked to school in hand-me-down shoes, the young mother who rocked her baby through long nights, the widow who kept breathing through silence, the woman who one day stopped chasing love that couldn't see her. I remember all of them, and I carry them with me. There's no fanfare. To this life now, no big gestures, no reconciliations, but there is peace. Peace in knowing I did what I could. Peace in knowing I left when I needed to. Peace in building something new, even if no one claps for it. I journaled something last week, a sentence that came without warning, like a breath long held and finally exhaled. I wasn't angry. It was finally empty. And that was beautiful. That's where I am now, not loud, not visible, not bitter, just full of space. And that, after everything, is enough.